without that. But you need much better execution, much tighter execution, much tighter DPS, much more gear. Honestly, hydraulics just makes it easier. So there's some things in the game
for the
right now that are really
uninformed. What does hydraulics do?
That's hold the line.
Hydraulic overrides negates the effect of physical things. You don't get knocked back. You don't get pushed around. You don't get slowed. Like, you are immune to any physical. No, not physical in that sense, but
so in that fight, presumably he's trying to slow you or knock you back or do whatever all day long, and as long as you get enough people with their movement negating ability, it makes it an easier fight.
Yeah, and especially just given the way that hard mode Revan works and the mechanics in Revan that are hard, hydraulics makes it a dramatically easier fight. Like, scary dramatically easier. And I think it's that particular encounter is poorly balanced because of how much it favors bounty hunters. But as a general rule,
and this is, by the way, this is also something that's available to not just mercs and power tech. It's not just mercs and commandos, it's also the power techs and vanguards. So that base class has an advantage.
Base class has an advantage, yeah.
Which is 25% of the advanced classes.
Right.
Yeah.
And it can do every role. So
right.
Tanks,
and
they've got heals, they've got ranged DPS, they've got tank, and they've got melee DPS. Yep. So pretty much the whole gauntlet.
And because of the current meta of the game, with merc healers being just so hilariously good, and merc healers having the shorter cleanse, and bounty hunter tanks having the various tools that they can apply, and power tech DPS and merc DPS just being so good right now, it's laughable. They made hydraulics the best utility in the game for the hardest fight in the game, and then they made power techs and mercs the best tanks, healers, and DPS in the game for the hardest fight in the game. So they're just winning on every level.
You said it. Okay, so power tech and vanguard tanks, you think they're the best tanks in the game right now?
For hard mode Revan.
Okay, for that fight.
They're not the best tanks overall. I think best tank is kind of a false attribution, because the difference between the tanks on most fights, or certainly across the average of the game, is the difference between the tanks is very, very minimal. Shadows and assassins take the least damage on average. They have the best mean mitigation. Vanguards and power techs take the most damage on average. They have different utility sets. Shadows and assassins don't have an instant gap closer, that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, they're very, 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 very close.
Do you think today that the balance of the tanks is actually probably the best post 3.0 than it's been previously?
Yeah, I think Shadows and Assassins are a little bit too powerful, but only by a tiny amount. I think Vanguards and Power Techs getting their additional cooldown has been fantastic. I'm really, really happy with the explosive fuel battle focus change. That's really great. But it's the thing that kind of screws up all of these balance discussions is just the way that the content works right now. The way that the content is on the hardest fight right now, and that just throws everything off, right? So when I said, Vanguards and Power Techs, best tanks, I mean best tanks for, hard mode Revan, and for the fights that are for the fight that's really going to get people stuck. They just bring the most to the table.
Okay. We did also want to cover the new changes for the healing mitigation effects.
So the different buffs that the healers can apply now?
Yeah, the Merc, Sork, and Operative.
So previously in the game, there were different things. So like the Sork Sage could increase the target's armor. The Merc applied a buff on its targets such that it would receive an increased, I think, 3% more healing from other heals. So they've standardized and kind of opened this up a little bit more. There's now 3 different healing buffs that can be applied. Each healer provides 2 of the 3, and they're designed such that if you bring 2 healers of a different type, then you'll have access to all 3 buffs. The 3 buffs are Invigorated, Protected, and Resistant. Invigorated reduces or increases healing received by 3%. Protected increases the target's armor by 10%, and Resistant increases the force tech resistance of the person. So great to do that. Now, just to kind of carry on with what was just said, all of that is true, but you need to take into account what the overall performance of that particular healing class is. So as was already mentioned, mercs are really popular right now. They're a very strong healing class. So just because a Sork and an Operative will offer one of these buffs that a merc doesn't necessarily mean that it makes sense to drop the merc or to drop a merc in favor of a Sork or an Operative. So, it's just the reality of it.
It pushes you a little bit towards class diversity, but the differences between players and the differences between how they apply to fights and just the the current balance differences matter a lot more than the buffs and debuffs.
Yeah, that'll always be true. So assuming that they get to true class balance, and that's a really difficult thing to define because it requires the same mechanics on every fight or something like until they get to that point, there's always going to be one class that has a slight edge. When it becomes a 10% edge or it allows them to cheese mechanics or something like that, that maybe is a poor design that needs to be changed. But when somebody has a theoretical 1% or even 2% edge over another one, that's really not enough to justify bringing a different spec or a different class. It just won't. That's not going to overcome all of the other factors that go in, lucky crit rolls, all of that stuff that happen, latency, all of that is just it's marginal. So, don't worry about it yet. Assuming we get to a point where there is parity among the different classes, more so than there's today.
Did you already cover the different debuffs that the tanks bring and how that's spread across the classes?
No, so tanks are similar to healing in the sense that there's 3 different ones. Each tank will apply 2, and again, as long as you bring 2 different tanks, you'll have access to all of them. And I think I got these right. They're weakened, unsteady, and impaired.
Actually, Oofalong, there's 4 tanking debuffs.
What's the 4th one?
Trauma.
Or what are they?
So trauma is also applied by some other players, by some other classes as well.
Right.
But it is baseline in the tanks now as well.
So
is trauma one that you've mentioned on any of these yet? Because it is a DPS one, I know.
So it's okay. So it definitely is applicable in PvP, and to my knowledge, there's been one fight in PvE where it was applicable. Do you know of any others? Brontis is obviously what I'm thinking about. I don't think there are, but I don't know.
For a very brief, hilarious time, trauma was applicable in the Dread Masters fight in hard mode, where you could put trauma on the bosses and prevent them from healing up as much from the holocron.
Right. So trauma
But Brontis is the most important example.
Right. So trauma is what reduces the healing received by the target. So obviously makes sense in a PvP setting because there are healers actively out there healing, and you can negate their benefit, negate their purpose by applying trauma to different targets. So
now, is it Jedi Knights, so Sentinels and Warriors, or Sentinels and Guardians, or Jugs and Marauders? They both apply trauma, is that right? And then I know Gunslinger Snipers do.
I don't remember the DPS classes that apply it. Obviously, Shattershot applies it, but in terms of the tank classes, it's Juggernauts and Assassins apply trauma.
Oh, Assassins do too. Okay.
Yeah. So Assassins have the easiest time of it. Power techs don't have trauma.
Is that something that they've actually added 3.0?
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
yeah.
So more people do have trauma.
Oh yeah. So now you can actually, as an assassin, it's sort of hilarious, especially if you're in 4v4. You can keep the trauma debuff up on your targets 100% of the time just by hitting lacerate every so often.
That's your AoE spin thing?
Yep, because it's melee damage that applies it for assassins.
Okay.
Yeah, so I guess that is an interesting debuff, buff, I don't know, depending on your point of view, what you want to call it, but I guess it's not specific to tanking, although I guess I didn't realize that 2 out of the 3 tanks offered it. So yeah, interesting, good point there. And definitely applicable to PvP. Don't think there's really any use for it in PvE aside from Nightmare Brontis.
Well, and importantly enough, since it's on 2 out of the 3 of the tanks, it means still bring 2 of any combination of the tanks, and you're going to have all of these buffs or debuffs.
Yep. There's some caveats in that, right? So the major caveat is, right, the 3 debuffs that Oofalong mentioned that are useful for PvE are accuracy, melee range damage debuff, and force tech damage debuff. Shadows apply the melee ranged, Guardians apply the force tech. Both Shadows and Guardians bring the accuracy debuff and bring trauma. Vanguards actually bring both the melee range and the force tech, but they don't have the accuracy debuff. Here's where it gets weird. The accuracy debuff doesn't stack with Riot Gas. And since Vanguards have Riot Gas, they could sort of get away without actually having the accuracy debuff because Riot Gas is actually better. So, in a sense, Vanguards
Does Riot Gas works on bosses?
Oh,
Absolutely.
Ooh,
Riot Gas
okay.
is oil slick for the Imperial players. That's oil slick.
Right.
Absolutely. It's a huge debuff, or it's a huge defensive cooldown that you'll use if you're tanking as a power tech or Vanguard.
Sorry, this is the only tank class I haven't tanked with. It will be in a few weeks. I'll start doing it, but I did not. I always just kind of assumed that was a non-boss mechanic, because we do have a few of those that are exceptions.
No, you can do a lot of fancy things with that. Like when we were doing, when my guild was doing Nightmare Titan 6 at tier, we ran a Shadow and a Vanguard tank. Whenever someone got the huge grenade, which is a series of 13 melee range attacks, we just dropped Riot Gas, and that negated almost all of them. So it was like giving a defensive cooldown to everybody who got the grenade.
Yeah. So that's interesting that even though the power techs don't apply that, and I think it's 45% reduction to accuracy, right?
Riot Gas, I think it's 30. It's 45-second cooldown, but it's 30%.
Okay. Yeah, for some reason
it's
I thought
more
32.
significant than the buffs that the other tanks apply in terms of reducing the damage. They only are reducing the accuracy. They're reducing accuracy by 5%, whereas the power tech Vanguard defensive cooldown does it for a much larger amount.
Yeah.
So, again, bring diversity or don't, because fight mechanics will really trump any of this. Again, this is all marginal benefits. If you can't execute mechanics, or there's certain mechanics that favor certain classes, that's just what happens.
Yep.
So that's all the new buffs and debuffs and everything. We haven't missed anything at this stage?
I guess the other thing that may be worth noting, so in the previous world, you had snipers, gunslingers, and marauder sentinels that had raid-wide utility. The sniper shield, the ballistic shield, I don't know what the gunslinger one is called, that reduced everybody's damage. Everybody under it benefited from that. And then marauders had that bloodthirst or inspiration. And now we've seen that they've introduced 3 other buffs to boost DPS. They're provided by a merc, sage, commando, mercenary, and operative, scoundrel, I guess. So the 3 healing potentially classes there. Every other class got something as well, I think. I'm actually not sure what they are, but they all got things similar to, I believe they got things similar to Sniper Shield in the sense that it would like reduce damage or provide some sort of other defensive utility.
Yeah, so obviously snipers have the ballistic shield / scrambling field. Shadows and assassins have phase walk now as baseline, so the old healing buff that shadow tanks used to have, now all of the classes have access, or now all of the disciplines have access to it. The downside being that it doesn't stack anymore, so you can't get like 30% increased healing. I'm very disappointed about that, but that it's a 5% increase to healing done when you're standing in the puddle, which is nice. So that's what Shadows and Assassins have. Guardians get the AoE taunt shield. So the AoE bubble thing that Guardian tanks used to be able to do, that's again baseline. So all of the disciplines have access to it.
Can I just say how freaking irritated I am that I can't use my AoE taunt in PvE anymore as a DPS?
Yeah.
And then I have to remember to use it as an aggro drop. It's like, oh my goodness, there have been so many times when the tank went down and I could pop all my defenses and use my AoE taunt while they're battle rezzing, but no, can't do it.
Yep. Yeah.
You think what?
I think that's a good change. So as somebody who primarily played Marauder, I took exception to when they made Bloodthirst Inspiration have a 5-minute cooldown, a debuff that got applied to everybody, because it discouraged you from stacking more Marauders. And don't get me wrong, I think you should have diversity, but the way they implemented that change was not what I thought the most effective way to do it, because there's no such penalty applied to the Sniper Shield. You can stack as many of those. You can chain stack those, which, again, see Severity Gaming and kind of how they would use a lot of snipers as an example of that. And so the same, like, if we think about raid utility as a concept, whether it's a DPS spec healer who can do the battle res or throw some off heals for you, the DPS spec